Conflict in church? Never. This is a holy place. We all get along all of the time. And you're looking at me saying, Pastor, do not lie in the sanctuary. Of course, there is conflict in church. We are people, and where people come together, there is always some form of conflict. I remember growing up as a good Baptist child, I like to go to those things we call church conferences today. We used to call them business meetings when I was young. Y'all remember some of those? I used to go because I just thought they were the most entertaining thing around. To see grown people argue with each other in church was amazing to me. The first time I was on a multi-staff church as an associate pastor, I remember being there and thinking, this is just going to be wonderful to be able to be with all these other pastors on a team, because I'd always been just by myself. And we went on our first retreat, and the minister of music and the minister of senior adults about came to blows. I thought, my goodness, what's going on here? But this has been true of church, of people, from the beginning. In the early church, wonderful things were going on. God was moving in marvelous ways. Thousands upon thousands of people were coming to Christ and becoming a part of the church. And we read about this, and then in Acts chapter 6, we read that conflict breaks out. Well, of course it did. There was such quick growth. All this diversity that we've been talking about, how the people came together from different nationalities and different backgrounds, meant that they were different. They would not see things the same way. How do you come together in such diversity and become unified? I remember several years ago, I was called by a large church in Birmingham, Alabama, to talk to me about possibly being their pastor. I remember this conversation distinctly because the person that was talking to me said, we are a good church. We have doubled in the last couple of years. We've added 300 people in the last couple of years. And I said, well, that's great. How are you assimilating those folks? How are you bringing them together and making them one church? And the man said, well, our next pastor will figure that out. I said, okay. Well, tell me about your last pastor then. Well, he left suddenly. We're not really sure why. And I said, well, how have y'all processed that? Have you got some help from some consultants? Have you talked about that? Has anyone reached out to him to maybe do an exit interview? And they said, our next pastor will help us figure that out. And then I asked a third question. I said, well, tell me about your staff then. And they said, well, half of them have left and the other half are probably going to leave. And I said, what are you doing to rebuild trust in your staff? And they said, well, our next pastor will solve that. To which I said, I know one thing, I am not your next pastor. I was not going to go into that setup. That congregation was not dealing with conflict, but rather putting it on their next pastor. And they were missing an opportunity. You see, because conflict can be a growth experience. When we deal healthily with those things that seem to pull us apart, it can actually lead to a growth personally and as a church. It's not whether or not we'll ever have conflict in church or in marriage or in any group. It is how we will handle that conflict. And the early church got some things right. They were focused on their mission, and that's one way to come together as a church. When they had this conflict and these Hellenistic church members came up and said those out of Judaism were not listening to us. They actually listened to each other. They didn't let it be about personalities, but about what's the problem here to solve. They affirmed and empowered each other. You see, in conflict, we always have a choice. Will we fight and fuss and split up and decrease as a church and as people? Or will we choose to come together and ask, what is our mission? What is our purpose? How can we hear the pain in one another and the problems that might be here, and choose to share power and grow as a church? You see, we have that choice to make, how we will face conflict in our lives each and every day. You might say, well, some churches choose not to do anything. Well, yes, they do, and it festers underneath the surface and slowly kills the church. We can either grow better or grow bitter in all of the conflict of our life. But conflict also carries positive potential. Chris Gamble, my friend that leads the Center for Congregational Health, says that conflict can actually build deeper community. That when you come together and you address it at its root and you talk to one another, you actually turn adversaries into friends. And you come together behind a purpose. And when you come together as a church, you actually have a deeper commitment to the mission of the church and to the outcomes of the church, because everybody has a voice and everybody has a buy-in. Chris says that every time a church does something, it sets a precedent. That if you resolve conflict well, the next time you encounter it, you'll probably solve it even better. If you don't do so well with it, you'll probably do that the next time. I sometimes do consult with other congregations. I remember some time ago I was called in to help a church, and they had conflict in their youth ministry. They had hired a new youth minister. And the new youth minister came in with some ideas and some different things, and the youth didn't really like it. It was change, and the parents complained to the church leaders, and the deacons got involved, and the staff got involved. And when I showed up with some other consultants, we said, we need to help y'all listen to each other. So we instituted some rules. We said, we're going to have some groups where we come together, and you have to use an I statement. You can't say, you did this or they did that, but rather, I believe or I think. And after someone uses an I statement, everybody else in the room has to understand what they're saying. Before we can move on, we have to repeat or reflect on that and make sure that they feel heard. Guess what? Something amazing happened. As they talked to each other, they discovered that they had more in common than they had different. That they all had the same goals for the youth ministry. The techniques are where they were tripping up, and how to accomplish those goals. And as they listened to each other, the new youth minister heard about the traditions of the youth and heard about some good things that were going on. And those that were the youth and the parents heard the new youth minister express his love and concern for the teens and for the church as a whole. And they began to hear some of the new ideas creatively and say, we could try that. And they ended up affirming both their heritage and the creativity that was before them as a future. And they did it as a team. No one tried to do it all. You see, no one can do it all. That's why we have to empower each other as a church and as an organization. When I was in my first church in seminary, I remember showing up there and listening to the people. The Davises were there, and they were some great saints of the church. They'd been there since that little church started. And when I got there, I visited in their home, and I remember hearing them say to me, Pastor, we feel like we have to do everything. This church dumps on us, and we're tired. We feel like no one else will step up and do anything. And so I started visiting in some other homes, and I went into some homes of some of the younger folks, and they said, the Davises won't let us do anything. The Davises run the whole church. Before we can do anything, they jump in and do it. We feel so left out, and we don't feel like they trust us. And I called a meeting in the church and said, you folks need to talk to each other. You're all saying the same thing. We need to learn how to share this ministry together. That's what was going on in the early church. A dispute arose. What happened was those of a Greek background were being discriminated against. And those of Judaic background were just kind of helping their own widows more than others. True discrimination, much like we face today. And instead of those with power saying, we don't really care about that, or that's not really true, or we're not doing that, they actually listened and heard them and said, let's find a solution to this. And they chose 7 people with Greek names. They let those folks who were complaining actually be a part of the solution. They let them handle it instead of micromanaging these 7 folks. You see, strong churches share leadership. And that has to be especially true of the staff. Staff-centered churches will grow stagnant. You see, if you give all the work to me and to our staff, we can only do so much, and we will become a choke point for the ministries of the church, whether we take that on or whether you give it to us. We cannot do it all. You cannot hire the church work to be done, because the church work is the work of the people of God. I remember one of my favorite church members of all time in a former church. Her name was Miss Vivian. She was not my favorite person the day I met her. In fact, I remember distinctly one Wednesday night, I was there and I was new, and I said, let's pray around the tables. The folks were sitting around the tables, and I said, I'll walk around, you have prayer at the tables, and then I'll lead a prayer at the end. And as they were praying, I was walking around listening to prayers, and I got over the table where Miss Vivian was sitting, and she was just sitting there glaring at me. When I got close to her, she looked at me and she said, preacher, why don't you pray? That's what we pay you for, isn't it? I thought, uh-oh, we're in trouble here. To which I politely said, no, ma'am, you actually pay me to equip you to do the ministry of the church. I will pray for you every day, but it's not just my job. It is all of our jobs. She said, where do you get that from? I said, well, I get that from the Bible. Ephesians 4:11 and 12 and 13 say, so Christ himself gave the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the pastors and the teachers to equip his people for the works of service so that the body of Christ might be built up. The purpose of the pastor and the ministers of the church is to equip the saints, to equip you to do the work of the church. Why did I say that Miss Vivian became one of my favorite folks? Because she actually listened to me. We had a number of conversations, and I said, tell me a little bit about your background. And she said, you may not know it, but I'm one of the first women who ever attended Wake Forest University. I said, how'd you do that? She said, well, I was a secretary there when my husband was a student. And as a secretary, I was allowed to take classes, and I actually took classes and went there when no other women were there yet. I said, it sounds like you have a lot to offer to this church. You are so creative. You are one that is a natural leader. And we started putting her in leadership. We formed a wonderful partnership, and we solved many problems together and did a lot of great ministry. Because everyone who is a leader should be giving away leadership. If you're a Sunday school teacher, you should be mentoring another teacher behind you. If you're a deacon, you should be taking someone in the church that you think would be a good servant of the church one day and taking them with you to go out and to visit, or talking to them about what it's like to be a deacon. If you're in the choir, you should be bringing other folks into the choir and saying, hey, this is a wonderful organization. If you're helping with youth, you should be reaching out to the rest of the church and tell them about what a great youth ministry we have. It is all about giving away our power. In the book Growing Young that we studied a couple years ago, it talks about key chain leadership. Literally giving the keys to the church away. That's what the early church did here in Acts chapter 6. There was a problem, and the apostles said, we can't do everything. Let us do the work that we're best at. And we're going to give to you the ministry of the church as well. In other words, if you see it, solve it. I told you a moment ago that these folks that they picked all had Greek names. They shared leadership with those who felt most disempowered. They empowered them. I'll tell you about another one of my favorite folks from a former church. His name was Paul. He was an executive, so I didn't really get to know him because he was so busy with his with his work. And then he retired one day, and he showed up the next Monday to the church. Now, I was a little bit anxious because I've had folks with a lot of power in their business who have retired and have shown up at church, and they kind of want to take over. They need to run something, so they show up at church, and I'm like, what's Paul going to do here? Paul showed up, and he said, Pastor, you know my wife teaches 3rd and 4th grade Sunday school. And I said, yeah, I know she does. She does a great job, and we appreciate her. He said, that room that she's teaching in is awfully dingy. I thought, well, here it comes. He's got a whole list of complaints. I thought, well, he's going to want us to put out some money to get our janitor, who's already doing too much, maybe to paint that room. And he said, well, here's what I want to do, Pastor. He said, I just retired, and I've got some time on my hands. He said, would it be all right if I paint that Sunday school room? I just want to check and make sure that I'm not overstepping any bounds here, and whatever paint color or whatever type y'all need, I want to make sure I use it. I said, Paul, it would be great for you to paint that Sunday school room. Here's the paint colors that we use in Sunday school. He painted her room, and then he came back a week later and he said, you know, Pastor, I painted that room and it looked so good, the room across it now looks dingy. I said, what do you think, Paul? And he said, I think I should paint it too. Well, within a couple months, the entire children's building was repainted, and he had moved into the adult education building. He saw a problem, and he just stepped forward, and he said, I'm going to work on this. Now, you probably already know this about me, but if you bring an issue to me at the church, I'm probably going to say, where is God placing you in this? Maybe if God is showing this to you, maybe God is asking you to be a part of the solution. Where do I get that from? Acts chapter 6. When they bring a problem to the apostles and they say, we get it, that's a problem. Go and solve it. When the church owns its own ministry, the church flourishes and grows strong. We're all called to use our gifts effectively. The 7, it says that they had wisdom. They were filled with the Spirit. They were respected people, and they gave of their best. I'll tell you about one more church member that I really grew to love and appreciate. I learned a lot from Miss Harriet. She was a retired school teacher, and she had been reading the newsletter, and it had all kinds of errors in it. And so the pastor before me said, well, Miss Harriet, if you keep finding these errors, why don't you just come be our editor? So she became the editor of the newsletter, and she showed up each week in staff meeting so she could hear what was going on, so she could put things in the newsletter. But what I really loved about her was that she was a detail person, and I'm not. So I'd have an idea, and Harriet would immediately start helping me with that idea. For instance, one time I said, why don't we have a block party as a church? And I remember she looked at me and she said, Pastor, that's a great idea. If we're going to close down that street, we're going to have to go and get permission from the city, and we're going to have to talk to the police chief. I said, I hadn't thought about that. She said, I'll take care of it. She said, if we're going to have this party, we need to make sure the deacons are on board. Would you like to make sure we get that on the agenda for the deacons meeting? I said, yeah, that would be great. She said, if we're going to have this block party and you're going to have different ministries present different booths and so they can tell what they're doing, we're going to have to get in touch with those folks. You want me to call them? I said, that would be wonderful. She said, how about refreshments? And I said, I hadn't thought about that. She said, I'll call the kitchen committee. We'll get them on that. She said, how about signage out front to tell the folks to come and join us? And what about the paper? And I said, well, goodness, that's a lot going on. She said, I'll take care of it. She just jumped in there and used her gifts effectively. Never did she have to be out front. She was always behind the scenes. And she was such an encouragement to me. You see, we need to learn not just to work together, but to encourage each other. I love Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 that says, "And let us consider how we might spur one another on towards love and good deeds." To spur one another, to bring out the best in each other. When I was in 4th grade, I was a part of the Royal Ambassadors. RA is what we called it. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like a Baptist Boy Scout group. I wanted to be the president of our chapter. So did my friend Peter. So we ran against each other, and Peter won by 1 vote. I was kind of mad because I voted for Peter because I thought you shouldn't be voting for yourself at church. Learned that lesson. But Peter won, and I was upset and pouting. And I remember our RA leader, Mr. Smith, came over, and he took me aside and he said, "Nelson," he said, "you are a leader. Whether or not you have a title is irrelevant. Peter is now the leader of this group. You need to choose whether or not you're going to support his friend, and remember, you are his friend. And this church and the work we're doing together is more important than any of us. What kind of leader are you going to be that would help this group?" In other words, long before Rick Warren ever coined it, Mr. Smith said to me, "It's not about you. It's about others." And so I decided that since Peter was my friend and this was an important group, I would do everything in my power to help him and to make it a good year for our group. You see, we all have to rise to the challenges of our day. These folks that are listed here as these first deacons of the church, they rose to the occasion. Yes, they went and they established a new process whereby all of the widows of the church were cared for, but they did more than that. Stephen, he immediately began to preach the good word, and you know that he was the first martyr as he was stoned. Philip, we find later on in Acts chapter 6, going and sharing the gospel with an Ethiopian eunuch, and the Ethiopian church is birthed from that movement that Philip had. Procurius was a helper of both Peter and John, and later on became the bishop in Nicomedia. Nicanor gave his life as a martyr. Timon preached in Asia Minor and became the bishop of Soli. He was known as a great healer. Nicholas is not as well known, but he stayed behind the scenes, helping the church to grow and to flourish. You see, they didn't just take on this little bit of responsibility. Whenever the church had more of a need, these people stepped up. They faced every challenge. Friends, brothers and sisters of Christ who have been placed at First Baptist Church for this day and this time, how will we meet the challenges of our day? How will we be the church amidst a pandemic? How will we be the church amidst days of conflict within our community and within our society? Days of misunderstanding, days of unease. There are some easy answers to that. We can be loving and kind. There's some easy answers to ministering in different ways. We can go online, which we've already done. We can call one another. We can take food, which we are doing. We can send gifts to those folks who are out on the front lines, helping those most in need, and we're doing all of this. But it's still not enough. There are some things that aren't so easy. It's hard to keep going to Zoom meetings, especially when people do them all day and week in their jobs, and then we ask them to come and do it in Sunday school or for other meeting. Others are tired of being at home. We don't like wearing masks, but we do it because we love our brothers and sisters. Loneliness has set in, or sometimes too much togetherness. And we as a church are put here today in the midst of this challenge, not just to look at the problems, but to look and find solutions, to get creative together. First Baptist Church is a first church. It means we were the first Baptist church to look here in Statesville and say, there needs to be a witness here in this place. And therefore, we need to be the first to step out and say, what is it that we can do right here and right now? I don't have all of those solutions, but God does, and the people of God do as well. You see, we are stronger when we are together. When we come together and we say, how can we be the church of Jesus Christ today? I love in the book of Acts that every few verses, there'll be a little summary verse about what's going on in the church. After they have this little conflict over serving those who are most in need, we find in Acts 6:7 this. And so the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. When the church came together and addressed the issues most urgent, both within the church and outside the church, the gospel spread and the church grew. We're coming up upon a holiday that's very important to our nation. It was on July 2nd, 1776, that the Continental Congress finally agreed to a Declaration of Independence. It took them a couple days later till two of them signed on July 4th. John Hancock, we know, signed because he put his big signature there. It took several weeks and even months for the rest of the delegates to sign. They had to think about it a little bit. Even though they'd come up and agreed with it, putting their signature on it was challenging because they knew that as soon as they put their signature on it, they would be under a death threat. We're not sure whether or not Benjamin Franklin said it, but he's credited with it, and I know that this was probably in the minds of all. Franklin is said to have said this: we must all hang together, or we will surely all hang separately. What was true for that fledgling nation is true for our nation today, and is true for the church known as First Baptist Church of Statesville. Let us come together and be the people of God. We're going to now have a hymn. Though you cannot sing here, those that are present with us, you can perhaps even mouth the words and let this be your commitment. Those of you who are at home, I hope that you will sing this and join in as we recommit ourselves to being the people of God for this time and this place.